Good evening to everyone. Thanks for being out tonight. We do a good number out. Appreciate you being here. And we will be studying from the book on lesson 25, talking about Solomon's view of David. And as most of you are aware, but I will refresh your memory, this will be our last class as far as with the study of David. And in the auditorium will be John Moore will be talking and teaching about, let me think what he's teaching about.
The root causes of apathy.
Root causes of apathy and lukewarm Christianity. So we look forward to that. And then in the other classroom, John Absher is going to be teaching on the peacemaker. And he's got a study guide here. And so if you're going to be in that class, please pick one of these up after services tonight. So you'll be prepared for Sunday. And he said it's not much there. If you could read all of that, that would be great. So have fun with that. We'll have fun with that. So we will we'll be looking at lesson 25 tonight, and you find all this in 1 Kings chapter 2 through 11, and hopefully we all know about Solomon. We've all heard about Solomon, and we talked a little bit about Solomon on Sunday, and you know when we talk about Solomon, a lot of times we talk about the really good things about Solomon, but the really sad news is there's some really sad things about Solomon too. I mean, he kind of had it all and let it slip away by not obeying God and doing what God had instructed him to do. So hopefully we'll get into some of that tonight and look forward to your discussion. So Solomon's view of David, it talks about famous last words, and the lesson goes through several characters and what their last words were. Talks about Moses and Joshua and others and what their last words were. And one of the comments in the middle of the first paragraph it says, we may really get to see the heart of individuals laid bare by what their final words may be to their loved ones. And this lesson kind of, this is David's last words to Solomon. And what did he have to say? And how did that affect Solomon? And did Solomon listen to his dad? Several things there, certainly, that we can talk about and discuss. And turn over to the second page. It talks about Jesus and Jesus' last words and his last time upon the earth. And then Paul, Paul's, the time of my departure is at hand. I fought the good fight, finished the course. That was Paul's kind of his last words. And then it asks the question, which would be good for all of us, I suppose. It might be a healthy exercise for us to ask. What should I say to my friends and loved ones if I knew the time I had left on the earth was short? If I only had a short time left on the earth, I knew that was going to happen. What would I want to pass along to my family, to my loved ones? And that's a kind of a soul-searching kind of question, and something I guess that we all ought to think about, because that will happen to all of us at some point, and how we will pass along information that we think others need to know, or what we would others to know about us. I think that's something that is important. Even so, we think about David and the individuals he influenced. Let us hone in on his final words to his son and future king Solomon. So let's look at 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 1 and verses 1 through 1 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 through 4. And I'll start out by reading that. And we've kind of looked at this before, but now the days of David drew near that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies that is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. that the Lord may fulfill his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So David's recounting this promise made to him by God, that if he would follow him and that if his son Solomon will follow him, that they would not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And so did that promise, did that come true, or how do we look at that? Kyle, you're nodding your head, so help us there.
Well, what he says is true in the sense that David's lineage continued to have a man on the throne in Israel.
Okay.
It's also true that whenever they did not follow God with all their heart and with all their soul, there eventually came an end to that physical lineage. But it's also true that they hadn't been doing that for a long time, and God was very patient to bring the consequences of that about.
Okay, so that's kind of you gave me kind of a mixed bag there. And then we get, spiritually speaking, I mean, we get to Jesus. And Jesus certainly is from the lineage of David. And so exactly how you want to apply that. We do know that following Solomon, what happened to the kingdom? It splits. It becomes a disaster. And his son, who is just a wonderful fellow, is who? Rehoboam. And what do we know about Rehoboam? The first story we hear about Rehoboam is what?
Listening to the wrong advisors.
Okay, listening to the wrong advisors. Gets some bad advice and makes a bad decision and immediately starts the splitting up of the 10 tribes, northern tribes, and the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And I just did a little background on Rehoboam. I know this is kind of off topic, but he's not a very good guy, and he followed a little bit in his dad's lineage as far as wives. Anybody know how many wives he had? I Googled it, and I lost it. He had 19 wives and 60 concubines, and at least 28 sons and 60 daughters. So Rehoboam is not. He's not right on. He's got some problems. But he and where did he learn a lot of that from? Unfortunately. And we'll talk about Solomon. Solomon ended up with how many wives? Way more. 700 wives, 300 concubines, it says. I thought it was interesting. How many children do we know about? From all those wives and all those concubines, how many children of Solomon do we know about? When I look up, we only know about 4. I mean, it seems really odd to me that we only know about 4 of all those wives and relationships he had. There's not much of a lineage there. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting, something I did not know. I don't know how important that is, but I did not know that. So, 1 Kings chapter 2, David's last words to Solomon, just keep the commandments. You do those things, you will prosper. You will not lack a man on the throne. And so we know from last class that he had another son, Adonijah, that tried to usurp the throne, and David had to step in and say, no, Solomon's the king. He is going to be, he's the one I want to rule. And he and Bathsheba worked to pull that off. So number 2 in our lesson book, what does David know is going to happen to him soon? We just talked about that. He's going to die. And what does David want Solomon to prove to the world after David has died? It says, prove yourself something. What do you want the world, what do you want him to prove? Prove yourself to be a man, to like David, the man after God's own heart. I guess David's wanting Solomon to prove himself to be a man. Would you say that Solomon carried that out?
As far as the world was concerned.
As far as the world concerned, yeah, we'll get into, he accumulated a lot of stuff, didn't he? He became a very wealthy man. And his early reign was, you would have to say, was good. I mean, his early days, you would have to say, was good. And we'll kind of see why when we get into, let's just look there now. 2 Kings chapter 3, you get into Solomon and where he gets how he manages to accumulate so much wealth and wisdom, and we know that comes from God. Let's read the first. Somebody want to read the first 1 through 5 for me? How about 1 through 4? I'm sorry, verses 1 through 4.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3, yes, sir. 1 through 4.
And Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter, and brought him into the city of David. And he had made an end of building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall of Jerusalem around about. Only the people sacrificed in high places, because there was no house built unto the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer unto that altar.
So we see Solomon here, and things are going well. They're at peace. He is as we'll see in the next few chapters. He's getting prepared to build the temple and to build a palace there in Jerusalem, and so things are going to be going really well in the next 3 or 4 chapters. But we see here the problem begins to creep in verse 1. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, married Pharaoh's daughter. So it's just an easy question. What would be the problem with that? When it gets God's will. God told him to do what, Steve?
To not marry foreign gods.
Okay. To not intermarry with all of these groups of people that they had taken over their territories, and do not marry their wives, and because you will be perhaps their other gods you will be accepting, and that is certainly what happened. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, and he married Pharaoh's daughter, and this was early in the story of Solomon, but certainly it became a real issue. And in verse 3, it said, Solomon loved the Lord. This looks like two different sides of the coin. Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statutes of his father David. And my version says, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. So what were the high places, and what was the problem with that? Okay, it's where the pagans worship, as Carol says. Certainly where the pagans worship. And certainly God would not be pleased with that at all. And Solomon knew better. He had been told not to do that. The children of Israel had been told countless times not to do that. But it says Solomon loved the Lord. So that's why it's kind of a contradiction there. Solomon loved the Lord. He walked, and it says in his statutes, except he sacrificed and burned incense at high places. And then he went on, this one burnt offering, said he offered 1,000 burnt offerings. That's really sacrificing a lot. So we start to see some of the problems that Solomon's going to have that really cause him problems later in his life. 1 Kings chapter 5, we get the interesting story of Solomon preparing to build this temple, and he gets all these materials that are being brought to him from other areas, particularly from Tyre, and they get floated down to him, and all that story is wonderful. And you start reading that. The thing that I thought was interesting is how God appears to him. I think it's in verse 5. God appears to him. How does God show up on the scene? 1 Kings 3 and verse 5. Sorry, I misled you all. 1 Kings 3 and verse 5. Shows up to him in a dream, doesn't he? It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you? So here's the time that God shows up and says, what do you want? I'll give it to you. And we know that Solomon chose what? He chose wisdom and understanding, didn't he? He chose wisdom and understanding. And verse 7 gives us a little bit about a hint of how old Solomon is at this time. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am he calls himself a little child, my version says, and I don't know how to go out or come in. So how old do we think Solomon is when he's taking over the reins here? He used the word little child.
He's old enough to have formed an alliance with Pharaoh through marriage.
Okay, he's old enough to have formed an alliance with Pharaoh to have his daughter in marriage. So, you can research it and look it up, and it's anywhere from 15 to 25. Most people settling around age 20, from what I saw. So, in Solomon's eyes, with all the responsibilities he's got and all the kingdom that David has established for him, it's a big job. It is a big job, and he wants and asks for wisdom. And is God pleased with that? Very much so. So not only does he give him wisdom, what else does he give him? Lots of things he didn't ask for. We start about verse 10. It says, the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked for a long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so there shall not be anyone like you among the kings of all your days. So if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So Solomon, because of the wisdom to ask for the right thing, got rewarded by God with riches and honors and things that he had not even thought of asking about. So 15 was interesting. Then Solomon awoke from his dream. So this is Solomon speaking to God in a dream, which is an odd concept. We don't really, I struggled with that a little bit. But after the dream, he got up, went to Jerusalem, offered burnt offerings, and things are good with Solomon. So that's the story we all mostly remember, is what he asked for instead of riches and honor, and God appeared to him in this dream and said, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get way more than that. And so this is the beginning of his reign, and it is very, very, very good. I mean, things obviously are going to be very good because God's going to take care of him and make sure things go well with him. In chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, you get the story about the two women and the small child, small baby. You may want to, and this is a demonstration of the wisdom of Solomon early in his reign, and evidently it became widely publicized and known, and everybody was understanding that Solomon really had something that everybody else didn't have. He was smarter than everybody else, and God was certainly blessing him because of the dividing of the child, and the real mother saying, do not saw the child in half. Let the other lady have it. We've all heard that story, but again, a demonstration of Solomon's wisdom and blessings that God has blessed him with. Thoughts, comments yet on anything I've said or missaid?
It is interesting in chapter 3, a couple things that chapter 3 brings out about Solomon is that he seems to be struggling. He has a very divided loyalty. And, it starts off with him not just marrying a foreign wife, but the daughter of Pharaoh. This is more than just a nation that's been conquered by God. It's the nation that God delivered them from. This is kind of the ultimate of betrayals that we hashed out in the wilderness. We don't rely, we don't need, we don't look back to Egypt. There's only death there. And now this treaty is, in a sense, and possibly preparing for maybe building the temple, building his kingdom, but he's relying on Egypt maybe for financial benefit. From, they have, they're wealthy and they maybe have much to offer. They certainly have chariots. Maybe they have an army that's better for us to be in alliance with, but it's not a reliance on God.
Okay.
And so that leads to him offering these offerings at different idols and things that are short of what God has called. But then when God shows up, he very clearly says, I don't know what I'm doing. And now he's currying favor with God, and after that he's making all these offerings to God. And it's I think very similar to our own lives today when we don't really know the direction forward. It's easy to get pulled in different directions. In 1 second, I'm going to rely on the world and what it has to offer. And the next, I remember God, and I want to rely on him. And we kind of see that picture of him with this divided loyalty.
Yeah, good point. He certainly seems to, he's struggling with remaining faithful to God and walking in the paths that David walked in. And with now he's the head of this big kingdom. And what's he going to do with it? Yes, sir.
Along with that, I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but I found it interesting in chapter 2 when David is giving his last words to his son Solomon. And it was specifically surrounding Joab, which is a big part of that whole discussion with Solomon.
Yes.
3 times during that whole discussion, in what I can see here, David calls him a wise person. Says he has wisdom, calls him a wise person. This is before he asked God for wisdom.
Okay.
And this is, I kind of feel like he's in his early 20s as well from everything. You think about people we know that are in their early 20s.
We normally call them wise, do we?
And usually the father is the least of the ones to say you're a wise person.
Yeah.
So I find it interesting that is there.
Yes.
And that David is saying it. And so much so that he knows that he's going to take care of Joab. He does give him that little incentive, be like a man, do what you're supposed to do.
Yep.
But at the same time, he knows he's got what it takes to do what needs to be done.
Yes.
And then he actually has wisdom. And then he makes these decisions that, like Kyle said, they're almost opposite of each other.
Yeah.
And it's almost this illustration to us of the different kinds of wisdom there are. You have the wisdom of the world, and you have the spiritual wisdom. You have the wisdom that is selfish. You have the wisdom that is able to be used for everybody's benefit. And Solomon had both.
Okay.
He had both. He obviously had the wisdom of the world initially. He knew what he
Right.
And that was selfish, when you think about it.
Right.
It was ultimately selfish, even though it was for the right thing, because God, was going to establish throne. At the same time, he knew he needed more to do what he needed to do. So he took it upon himself to do two things. He used his wisdom of the world that he had and married into Egypt to do exactly what Kyle was saying, I think, to gain all this political and riches and everything else to do what he needed to do. And at the same time, he stayed on, and I'm judging him in some ways, but I don't know how else to say it. So I'm saying, I don't know how to say it. To stay on God's good side and ask him for spiritual.
Yeah, certainly playing both sides of the street, isn't he?
And those two things come with that word that we've used so many times, discernment. Discernment is so extremely important when it comes to wisdom, because people can be wise, but do they have the discernment to use that wisdom correctly?
Okay. Good point. Thank you. Lots of good comments there. Appreciate that. Yes, sir.
I think one other thing in this section that stands out to me as I read through it, verse 3 has such a powerful, gut-wrenching word tucked right in the middle of it. Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statutes of his father David,
Except, yeah.
and I just can't help but, as examine my own life, if that was a sentence written about me, what's that exception? That exception that finishes the end of that sentence.
Yeah, great point. And unfortunately, most of us have one of those, don't we? Or we have had, or we're fighting against one. We have those exceptions. We want to do all that God asks us to do, and we'll follow Him as hard as we can, except for in that one thing. I just can't. I'm struggling with that. And so certainly we can apply that to ourselves, Kyle, as well. Very, very good point. Anything else on those comments? So then we've kind of looked through, I think we're down to 1 Kings chapter 4, and Solomon's setting up his administration in first almost 25 verses there, 29 verses. He's setting this kingdom up, and he's putting all these people in place, and I'm certainly not going to get into all that, but you get down to verse I had 28. That's not the right verse. Chapter 4, 29 through 34. It says, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and there's that, I guess, discernment as well, and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. I thought that was interesting. He had wisdom and all that, but he had largeness of heart. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of all the East and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. And listen, fellows there. And then Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spoke of trees from the cedars of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish, and men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth, who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So God had certainly blessed Mr. Solomon, and he has got wisdom and largeness of heart, and we know that he had other writings that we know all about. Said he spoke Proverbs, and we have most of the book of Proverbs written by Solomon. We also have Ecclesiastes written by Solomon, and Song of Solomon. So you've got those three books in the Old Testament that Solomon was certainly penned most of, or had a lot to do with the penning of those books. Interesting. When did he write those? Anybody have any idea? So he's got three we're talking about there: the Proverbs and Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes in his life. Anybody have a thought of when those were written? It's not part of the lesson, but in my study, most people think Proverbs was written early during this time when things are good, and he's got wisdom, and he writes proverbs, and those are the wisdom proverbs that we sometimes call them. And then Song of Solomon just a little after that. And then finally, when he's older and can look back on some things that he's done wrong, perhaps is when he writes Ecclesiastes. And
That was around 931 BC.
okay,
Ecclesiastes.
okay. So I'm hoping that's near the end of his reign. I don't know exactly what his reign was. We know it was 40 years, but I think Ecclesiastes was probably written toward the end of his reign.
What's largeness of heart? Is it generosity?
Great question. Miss Carol asked, what is that? My version says largeness of heart in verse 29. Has somebody got another version that uses some other
Mine says breadth of mind.
breadth of mind?
What's
Okay.
that?
Now you really confused her.
Yeah.
So help us. What do you think it means?
Come on.
Well, heart's on the inside, right?
Yeah.
And so heart doesn't always mean the blood pumper. And so I think it's just, your inner, I don't know if you want to say monologue, but I think the next version said like understanding as, yeah. And so
Okay.
just a different way of saying that.
And the words around it give a little bit of meaning to it as well. And remembering, as he pointed out, heart doesn't always mean your actual pumping heart, but it also doesn't always mean emotion and generosity and compassion. It was oftentimes used. Love God with all your heart would have been referring to the way you think and devoting. A lot of times your mind and your heart were linked together in Hebrew writing. So with the words around it, wisdom, discernment, mind, or wisdom, discernment, heart, I think it helps to paint the picture that his intellect, the ability of Solomon to reason was greatly expanded.
Yeah. So much so that people came from all over the earth, it says there, to hear his wisdom and to learn from Solomon. So, yeah, very, 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 it wasn't something that only a few knew about. Evidently, everyone was aware of Solomon and his wisdom.
It may just be simple as breadth means breadth, right? The verses talk about botany and biology and proverbs and spirituality, and he knew a lot about a lot of stuff.
Yeah. His breadth of knowledge. Okay. Anything else there?
Mickey?
Yes, sir.
The New King James Version somewhat reflects what Kyle said. It says, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding,
Okay.
and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore.
Okay. Thank you. So we as we're trying to get to chapter we're trying to get to chapter 9 and 10 and 11. I don't know if we're going to make it or not, but we got to.
Skip on over.
So I'm just going to tell you what happens in chapter 5. Solomon prepares to build the temple. He's preparing. Trying to get all the building materials ready, and some great. You need to read that. And then chapter 6, he starts to build. He starts to build in chapter 6, and we learn there in that chapter that he works on the temple and it's completed in 7 years. So it was a huge project. Solomon is building the temple. You get to chapter 7, and Solomon's building what? His house. He's building the palace. He's building with all the extravagance that's there, and all the gold, and all. I mean, the value of what Solomon puts in the temple and in his palace is unfathomable. In verse 80, in chapter 8, he brings the ark into the temple, and then chapter 8. Verses 22 through 53 is this great prayer that Solomon makes. And if you hadn't read that prayer, take time to look at that. I mean, it's a fabulous prayer that Solomon prays. And you'd have to think right now with this temple and this palace and all the wisdom that, how could this guy mess up? How in the world could this guy mess up? But I'm telling you, he does. Not yet. Not till we get to chapter 11. Chapter 9, the Lord appears to him the second time. Pretty cool that the Lord actually appears to him. And again says if, in verses 4 and 5, if you'll remain obedient to me, they'll never fail to have a successor on the throne. Tells him that, but then in verses 6 through 9 he says, but if you mess up, there's going to be curses. There's going to be lots of curses that come upon you if you're not obedient like you should be. So that's kind of laid out several times. And you know, follow me and things will be great. If you depart from doing what you should be doing, then it's not going to be good for you. Chapter 10 is kind of an outlier. That's some lady shows up to investigate him. Who is she? Queen of Sheba. And where in the world is Sheba? Anybody here been to Sheba? John Moore's not here. I know Kim's been there. Kim, you been to Sheba? Where is it? It's Ethiopia, Egypt. Yeah. You just pack. You just pack. Most would say Sheba is in the Yemen and Ethiopia area. And so the Queen of Sheba, and why does she head to Jerusalem? What does she want to know? Ma'am?
She wanted to see all the riches and how it's farmed.
Yeah, she wanted to see what everybody's talking about. And did Solomon show her everything? I think it's interesting what's said in verse 7. Somebody will read 1 Kings 10 and verse 7.
Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard.
Okay, so I've heard great things about you, but now that I've seen it, I wasn't told the half of it. You are way exceeding the word that's out there about you and your kingdom and your wisdom. It is just beyond. It is beyond understanding. And gave a great report. And she gave lots of money and spices, and heard Solomon exchange some goods, and but that's the story of the Queen of Sheba and how she shows up, and then it goes on to talk about his wealth and how much it is, and I didn't get into the calculations, but it's a lot. And I'll tell you all that and how great things are, and then we get to 1 Kings 11, and we find the downfall of Solomon. Somebody want to read? Yes, sir.
One thing real quick before that. Moses was telling the people before they entered the land of Israel in Deuteronomy 17 what's going to happen, that they're going to have a king. And he gave them 3 specific warnings of what not to do.
Okay.
And one thing he said, Deuteronomy 17:16, don't multiply horses from yourself or return to Egypt to multiply horses. And also don't multiply wives for yourself, verse 17, and don't greatly increase silver or gold for yourself.
Okay.
Interesting. All 3 of those things are mentioned right here in verse.
Yeah, great point. So if you didn't hear Jason, Deuteronomy 17, 16 and 17 is where they were children of Israel, and I guess, did you say Moses? That directly said, this is what's going to happen. But don't go in there, don't go back to Egypt and get horses, don't go back and get wives, and don't get their gold and silver. And it's exactly what Solomon begins to do. So, good point. Thank you.
Mickey.
Yes, sir.
And kind of adjacent to that, we mentioned Solomon doesn't mess up till chapter 11, but Solomon, the whole book of Kings, being written in the period either during or post-exile, is answering, how did we mess up and end up in exile? And Solomon is a part of that. It's interesting, we keep saying he built the palace and he built the temple. The reality is he didn't build any of it. He forced the Israelites into slavery.
Okay.
And they built all of that. Chapter 7 talks about how he did that. In a sense, what we read in chapter 3, he entered into a relationship with Pharaoh, likely because he admired and relied upon some things that Pharaoh had that he thought he needed. But by chapter 7, he looks like Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Capturing Israel to build his palace and his cities.
Yeah, so if you read through there, to Kyle's point, Solomon had forced labor of the Israelites, and they were forced to work. And to Kyle's point, just like when they were in Egypt, and Pharaoh forced them to build him all the things that he had them build. So good point. How it was he was following exactly in some of the things that they were told exactly not to do. So you get to chapter 11. It says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign wives, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh." So we know he's already married her. Women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. And so, for it was so when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord as did his father David. And then it goes on to talk about his worship and how bad it was and how wrong it was. So, distinctly told many, many times, you don't intermarry, you don't follow their gods, and Solomon did it in spades and turned his heart away from God. And in verse 13, 12 and 13, "Nevertheless, I will not," let's start above that just a little bit. 9, "So the Lord became angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, and he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days. For the sake of your father David, I will tear it out of your hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." So he tells him what's going to happen there, and we kind of talked about that earlier. The kingdom is going to be split. Rehoboam is going to get 2 tribes, and Jeroboam is going to get the 10 tribes. And is this servant that he talks about, give it to your servant? That's Jeroboam. Jeroboam is serving him now, and we read about Jeroboam doing some things for him that Solomon had raised him or elevated him. But he's going to be given the 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes we call them. Yes, sir.
You know, a couple of names that stand out in that list when you start reading about all the different women and all the different gods that he served, are names like Chemosh and Molech. And when we think of Solomon, it is so interesting that one of the greatest things we remember about Solomon is how he saved the life of one child from being cut in 2. But Molech was a god that was worshipped with child sacrifices. And it makes you wonder how many children died because of his allegiance to this false god.
Yeah. So I just think that the story of Solomon, we're about to run out of time, is just such an interesting story. He certainly had it all, we would say. Things were going great. The Lord was with him. He was following the Lord. But he except for a few things, that led him into a lot of things. And in the end, the kingdom is taken away from him. And he doesn't, he certainly doesn't recover from that. So I think that's a very, very interesting story. I run across an article by a guy named Max Dawson, some of you know. It says, in my mind, it is one of the most difficult things to reconcile. How did it happen? How could it possibly happen? He said, I'm talking about King Solomon. How did the wisest man in the world mess up so badly? How did a man with such a great beginning have such a terrible ending? And that's a sad commentary on a man or a woman. To start out so good and doing God's will and doing things so great, but yet start veering off, and before it's over, you're way off the path. And that's certainly the picture we have of Solomon. That's all I got. Thank you all very much. Appreciate all the comments this quarter. Y'all have been great. Y'all have taught me a lot. And I certainly, I know Luke feels the same way. We've learned way more than you all have, but you all have taught us great things, and we appreciate being able to lead the class. But thank you very, very much. Look forward to